The Sound of Damian Wayne. Written by Magnoliabee. Read to you by Evie is Evil. Chapter 7. Why are you so quiet? Cody tapped on his desk as he leaned in his chair, a frown on his face. Mrs. Briggs had forced them to collaborate for the day, working on a project that would represent some piece of Gotham history. They had gotten the short end of the stick, shafted with retelling what was there before Gotham, which had a limited knowledge base. Since he couldn't write, he'd made things clear by snatching the paper from Cody and drawing on it, outlining where words would go as he worked. Cody huffed. You used to be really mean. Now you're like a mute or something. It was an offensive statement on so many levels, none of which Damian could or would acknowledge, as he worked on coloring in a dreary little village. Apparently, a town named Grayville had resided there once, though it had burned down at some point, nearly every villager dying in the fire. Mildly interesting, but not important in the slightest. There were just 30 more minutes on the clock. It was a last-minute project because his teacher had decided there were too many empty spaces on her walls, and thought that this would suffice in depicting what usually goes on during her classes. He didn't have plans for that night. Technically, Alfred wouldn't be picking him up that day. It was supposed to be Tim. He usually went home early on Wednesdays and helped out Alfred by picking up Damian. Of course, the schedule was inconsistent at best, as Tim was usually God knows where with God knows who. It was irritating, but there wasn't much he could truly do. Today, it would work to his advantage. Normally, if Damian didn't vacate his school on time, his brother had a hard cutoff and would ditch him. Something he had found out after trying to help Miss Liesel after school. In such situations, he normally ended up taking the dreaded bus system, a good motivation to not be late. So the solution for the issue of this open house was simple. He'd let Tim leave and then loiter around the nearby park until 6:30, when it was supposed to begin. He could attend for 30 minutes or so, make his presence obvious, and vacate. Then he'd take the bus home. It was logical in his mind. Dinners were always rather late in the day, and it was entirely possible his absence would go unnoticed. Man, I hate this class, Cody muttered as he began to methodically bend pencils until they snapped in half. There was a growing pile of splinters on his desk, as many more shot across the classroom. Why don't they just let me drop out? I don't need school. My mom said I'll get to be the boss of our company anyway. Damian tutted as he finished off his drawings, not bothering himself to answer, nodding as he approved of his handiwork. The drawings he had made had all been highly obvious nods to old history, such as a courthouse to represent the witch trials that had occurred at one point there. Damian thought it wouldn't be the worst thing to revisit at that moment. He hoped that somewhere in Cody's minuscule mind he would recognize them. He slid the page over to Cody, who groaned as he stared at it. The boy looked up, a wide and conniving grin plastered on his face. Hey, since you're so smart, I figure that you probably don't want me messing all your stuff up. Why don't you just write what you want to? He cut himself off as Damian sent him his most scornful look. Cody sighed, grumbling to himself as he began to work. It would surely not earn Damian any higher than a B, but he figured that would be an improvement when compared to his previous performance. He dropped to a C and was counting down the days when his report card would grace his father's desk. That would not end well for him. His father was rather insistent on the merits of the American education system, as non-exhaustive as it was. One of the rules for being Robin was maintaining proper grades, which was not currently occurring and would be difficult to rectify, even once the spell disappeared. How's the project coming along, boys? Mrs. Briggs asked in a sing-song voice, leaning over the two to stare at the paper in Cody's hands. It's going, I guess, he answered, glancing at Damian pointedly as if he would save him from something. Damian raised his eyebrows, knowing what was about to go down. Really, because I've been seeing things fly through the air over here. She looked down at the pile of broken pencils on Cody's desk. Are those mine? Damian stared at the clock as his teacher proceeded to chastise Cody for his ill-mannered behavior. There was a swell in his chest as he listened to her assign him lunch detention. It was a pleasant interruption to his normally monotonous days. They'd begun to blend together as of late. He let out a quiet breath as the bell finally rang to end the day. His school functioned on a rotating schedule, meaning the class he ended with changed each day. On Wednesdays, his last class was PE. That was lucky for him at this particular moment, as he had to change out of his gym uniform, which thankfully had an option of sweatpants and a hoodie that he'd chosen at the beginning of the year, back into his usual outfit. Of course, he did so in a locked bathroom stall, on account of the admittedly concerning on anyone else number of scars littering his body. They differed in size and shape, and the simple excuse of a car crash would not account for all of them. There was a point of using serious car crashes as an excuse, at which the questioner begins to wonder why ever one would continue to get into vehicles. It was around the point of 4 that this reaction tended to occur. A shockingly small number in Damian's opinion. Surely some more leeway could be given. His classmates hollered around him, pushing each other into lockers and laughing as they tumbled to the floor. He ignored them in favor of making his way to the outside bathroom, placing his phone on silent as he did so. Tim would surely be waiting, and all Damian had to do was take his sweet time. Seeing as both his father and brother had been ornery of late, and from their sporadic talks at the dinner table, Damian garnered that there were some internal issues going on at the business. His father liked to promote people he thought were engaging in illegal activities to make his investigations easier. That, of course, had the offset of making his company run less smoothly, and always ended up blowing up into a more serious degree when the embezzlement or other form of fraud occurred. Damian sighed as he locked himself in a bathroom stall. He unzipped his bag and changed into his school uniform at a decidedly meandering pace. He glanced at his arm, noting the rough bruising on his wrist. It was beginning to be more pronounced, slowly but surely. He studied it for just a second more, before pulling on his shirt. The halls were quiet for once as he slipped out of the bathroom. Tim should have left by then, but he is not inclined to risk a sighting. The school had a side exit, and he made his way there, dodging the janitor by hiding behind a corner. There was a breeze as he pushed open the large metal door, carrying a distinct scent of burning tires in the air. He scrunched his nose as he checked his surroundings, making sure nobody was lurking as he hurriedly walked down the street, in the opposite direction from the front doors. There was always a slight thrill he felt at managing to irritate Tim in some way, as simple as it was. The park was a mere few blocks away, which he navigated easily as he kept to the sides of buildings to avoid being spotted. His phone had already had about 5 notifications, which were probably Tim airing his grievances at having to go out of his way to pick Damian up, and him not even being there. Perhaps he had a reason to be upset, but that was not to be acknowledged by him on that particular occasion. Instead, he continued on, and was finally greeted by the sight of the Victorian-style fences that guarded Gotham's largest park. It was heavily funded by his father, supporting the development of a lush landscape of stately trees and winding paths. Ivy was known to care for the area, and anyone who tampered with it had her to answer to. Damian was not inclined to face her wrath on that particular day, and instead took one of the branching walkways to enter deeper into the park. What surprised him was to see small patches here and there of browning shrubbery, as if they were wilting. He wondered if someone had dumped some sort of chemicals in the forest in an attempt to get rid of them. The foliage above him had begun to change color, a picturesque mix of orange and red, soon to overtake the entire city. Such autumnal hues were pleasing to the eye, and he silently hoped they'd speed up the process, just for him to enjoy the sight sooner. One could likely spend hours in the small woods, with ever-growing shrubbery and numerous deer trails. It was a tempting thought to lose himself in the shaded forest, but he had no time for frivolous whims such as that, and instead followed an only slightly worn path down to the man-made center lake. There was an old bench, the dark iron dedication sign, rubbed off from the many decades it had been left forgotten. Dick had shown it to him during a reconnaissance mission, as they waited for their targets to show up. It had been during the time when it was just them, just Dick and Damian. He found himself missing it sometimes, a thought he always quickly shook away. There were a few hours till the open house began. He hadn't much more on him than what was in his bag. Thankfully, as he rummaged through his backpack, he found a book he'd borrowed from the school's library, buried under a few folders. Hopefully, it would manage to tide him over until then. As he sat, he periodically glanced at his phone. He wasn't quite sure what he was waiting for. Perhaps a call? He flickered through the messages that Tim had sent and wasn't surprised by what he read. Drake, 3:12. You have 3 minutes before I'm leaving. Drake, 3:13. I have a lot of stuff to get done. Drake, 3:15. Seriously, I don't even know why you're upset at me. Drake, 3:16. All right, the next bus is at 4. Drake, 3:16. Have fun on that. He couldn't help but scoff at Tim's rambling. Never mind the inconsistent punctuation and use of abbreviations. He was much too stuck on this inane idea that Damian was upset with him. Really, he gave himself too much credit. Tim did not pass through Damian's head nearly enough to warrant such a reaction at this junction. He sighed, leaning his head back against the cool bench. A crow cawed overhead. The water lapped lazily on the rocky shore. He glanced at it, staring at his rippling reflection. Damian would be shocked to find real life enduring in the lake, on account of how many toxins had surely been dumped in during periods when Ivy was locked up. Perhaps mutant life could survive, but still improbable. It was an interesting thought to play with, but not enough to stave off the boredom he faced. Small crowds shuffled inside the school, jewelry glistening and haughty laughs echoing from the open doors. He tugged at the collar of his uniform, thoroughly regretting his decision. He had dumped his bag in a well-groomed bush by the building, aware it would be very obvious he hadn't been home yet if he carried it inside. His uniform was largely clean, with a slight coating of dust on the bottom hemming, from where a dog had jumped on him as he walked toward the school. Damian had found it hard to truly mind, but it was a bit of an irritant. He did not enjoy appearing ill-prepared. That suggested a sort of weakness that he did not pertain to. Damian Wayne, so glad you made it. A smooth, almost robotic-sounding voice rang out through the crowd. And who will be joining you tonight? Damian glared as a man in a sharp suit sauntered up to him, a practiced smile on his face. He recognized him to be his principal, Mr. Awry. The man enjoyed calling out students by name, as if it were a party trick. He had pronounced Damian like he was sounding it out for the first time, the vowels heavy on his tongue. He left out the Al Ghul part of Damian's name that his father had insisted on including in formal documents. However, so he thought it to be a surface-level attempt at best. Is your father already here? Mr. Awry asked as he swiveled his head around, his eyes squinting slightly from the strain, if he had to guess, from the blinding white smiles being flashed all around them. Damian merely stared back. There wasn't much of an answer to give. By the school's own rules, only he had to attend. It was supposed to be some sort of fun event that would mean parents would want to go if their kids were there too. There was the implication that the parents would attend with their children, lest they desire to seem uncaring, and it seemed to function aptly from the mainly adults milling about. It appeared that every child had a guardian of sorts present. Mr. Awry clasped his hands together, his posture faltering slightly, as he pursed his lips before schooling his expression once more. Well, that's all right. Let's make sure you have a ride home. He motioned Damian toward the doors, and he obliged begrudgingly, stuffing his hands into his pockets with a scowl. He just had to be seen at the event, and issues would hopefully resolve themselves. It had been tempting to skip it, but he couldn't handle any more discussions with Dr. Dahlman, or for the school to actually make a proper attempt to call his father. It was a bit odd that it had taken so long. The school was difficult to navigate, even for him at that moment, with families halting in their tracks to observe shoddy artwork pasted onto lockers and walls. They gathered around display cases, admiring plastic trophies with the same wonder as if they were shining jewels. He shimmered by a burly man, laughing heartily with his snotty children by his side, and finally made it to Miss Liesl's room. He knew she would want him there, and thought he could grant her wish at that moment. He prepared himself for the usual flashiness that accompanied her very existence, and yet it was still startling to enter the room. She had decorated every part of the classroom with streamers and origami hanging from the ceiling tiles. Portraits and drawings were displayed on the walls, with carefully written-out signage, indicating the artists beneath. She'd even cleaned the floors, for perhaps the first time ever, and he was surprised to see they were actually a uniform beige tone. What was most striking was the painting hung on the center wall, much larger than the rest of the minuscule pieces. He took a shallow breath in as he walked closer, looking upwards. It was his piece, clearly now varnished. She'd mentioned planning to do that, which was appreciated, as the task was tedious with the fumes and general mess it came with. Still, he was mildly surprised by the lambency the piece now attained. The colors were vivid, painted blue eyes shining much the same way as gemstones. He could admit it was one of his better pieces, acceptable for display at such an event, at the very least. He stood by it, glancing at the white plaque to the left of it. His name was there, as well as grade level, notably without a title, as he hadn't produced one. He was not certain he would have had any ideas, even if he had been able to share them with ease. The Wayne family felt dishonest, as did belonging. He considered at the table, which felt appropriate, but still lacked something that he could not quite place. Damian mulled these thoughts over as he stared at the painting. Parents and children ambled by, murmuring appreciatively as they glanced at his work. A girl from his art class gave a timid greeting, which he responded to with a slight nod. She looked back at her family, who must be her parents, smiling at her. Even her brother and sister were there, who appeared to actually be enjoying themselves as they looked at her fondly and admired the art pieces arranged so neatly on the walls, even while clearly much older than their younger sister. There was a thrum in his chest as he observed this, which he pushed down quickly. "This is yours?" He turned to his right to find someone he surely did not want to, and did not ever want to see, Dr. Dalman. The man had ditched his usual garb for marginally more professional clothing, of a wrinkled collar shirt and long khakis. It was more adjacent to an office worker than a school counselor, but it was surely an improvement. "It's very beautiful. I'm glad you submitted a piece." He stared at the painting, not looking down at Damian as he spoke. "I actually have a question about it." Damian glanced over, his brows furrowed as he wondered what the man could possibly have questions about. It was a dinner scene, nothing more, nothing less. "This has to be your father." He gestured to the figure. "And these are your brothers and sisters. And I'm guessing this one is your butler?" Damian nodded tentatively, unsure of where this was going. "But there's an empty chair. Is that supposed to be yours?" He couldn't exactly explain that his formerly dead brother was the owner of the seat, even without a curse, so he made a non-committal shrug, letting the man make the assumption. The man's face was unreadable, serene as if he were making small talk, and perhaps he was, but Damian had suspicions there were ulterior motives at play. "Did you leave early, or—" The man placed a hand on his chin, as if he was truly analyzing some underlying messages in the painting, which was a stretch in Damian's opinion. "Maybe you didn't come. Why do you think you're missing?" Damian huffed, annoyed by the pestering. There was no answer to give. He wasn't there because it would not fit with the painting, nor would it make sense in the scene he attempted to capture. There was nothing to be explained. Dr. Dalman rocked on the balls of his feet, letting them stand in silence. It was like his questions were rhetorical. He didn't expect any answers. This was all routine for him, seemingly. Clacking footsteps grabbed Damian's attention, and he turned to see who the originator was. Ah, Damian, you made it! Miss Liesel appeared by the pair, a glowing smile on her face. She placed a hand on Dr. Dahlmann's shoulder, and he turned round with his eyes slightly widened. I see you and Mark are appreciating your piece. Isn't it marvelous? I've had a lot of people ask me about it. They say the resemblances are uncanny. Juliet, hello. Dr. Dahlmann muttered out, a dusting of red drawing to his cheeks quickly, and he cleared his throat. Yeah, it's very lifelike. Oh, just call me Julie. You're so formal all the time. Damian took a step back and let Miss Liesel sweep forward, her hands going every which way as she excitedly jabbered to Dr. Dahlmann about how excited she was to be there and why don't they hold more events like this in an upbeat voice. She could be a lot to handle for him at times, admittedly, but in the moment, Damian appreciated her ability to take over the room. Dr. Dahlmann was nodding along politely as she began pointing out portions of the painting. With the counselor distracted, he managed to get some respite as he inched toward the door, finally slipping out when Miss Liesel accidentally dropped her phone while she was describing the process of decorating the classroom with dramatic movements. The echoing noise made it easy for him to finally get away. She gave a small wink to him, and he wondered if she'd meant to give him an escape all along, before brushing the thought away. Really, he could very well leave at this point. He'd been seen by a multitude of staff. There'd be no claims to be that he hadn't at least come to the event. It did not matter that no one had shown. It did not matter that his father hadn't bothered to inform Tim or Alfred, or even Cass or Jason. Damian did not need anyone by his side, and leaving really was just that easy. This idea was pleasing, and so he decided to follow it. He hurried down the halls, dashing down empty staircases to reach the ground floor. His side thrummed as he walked, an irritating ache that had been there for days at that point. There were still individuals around, but they were generally making their way towards the gymnasium, where a school play was being held. He had his doubts about the enjoyment one could find in watching children bumble and butcher through Shakespearean language, never mind the state of the prop selection. Miss Liesel kept attempting to get him to agree to paint set pieces. The front doors pushed open with a satisfying click, cool air rushing forward as he stepped out. His clothes still itched, and he glanced toward the bush where his backpack hopefully still was. It was to his surprise that a dark car pulled up into the fire lane, the driver shoving open the door with great force. Tim did not exactly look pleased, if his creased brows and taut mouth were any indication. His clothing was crinkled and thrown together, his tie loose and hanging limply from his neck. Damian was not certain what the issue was, but he had an inkling it had something to do with himself. Tim perked up as his eyes reached Damian, his shoulders slumping and his breath leaving him. Nice of you to mention this. You can't show up alone to a school event like this. What the hell? He cut himself off sharply as he stood by Damian's side. An artificial smile plastered on his face as the front doors pushed open behind them. Damian looked back to see Mr. Acaria, the man's eyes widening slightly as he took in the scene before him. Mr. Drake, I'm so glad you made it. We were starting to worry something had happened. He adjusted his jacket as if he had been hurrying. Couldn't have him taking the bus home. I mean, some of the recent scare gas attacks have definitely shaken our little community. Not to mention, he is a bit... He cut himself off with a knowing smile, making a downward motion with his hand to indicate height. Damian glared, but said nothing. It was odd to consider a school a community, but he concurred that with the rest of the principal's statement that there was reason to be wary of the transportation system as of late. Some canisters of fear toxin had exploded in the buses in the last months, which was not optimal for usage. Of course, Damian would likely be able to dive out of the bus through the emergency windows before getting hit with the full effect, so the worry was a moot point. Yeah, we can't have that. Tim's smile appeared strained, even for his standards. It's nice to meet you. You must be Damian's principal, Mr. Acaria. Could I escort you two toward the auditorium? A play is being held by the drama class. I'm really excited to see it. They've been working so hard. Well, everyone has. He clasped his hands together. You must know all about that, of course. Damian's painting is really something. That's a talent that should be supported. Painting? Tim quirked a brow, and Mr. Arcaria frowned for some reason. Damian glared as his brother continued. I'd love to stay, really, but we gotta get home. Big dinner and all that. It was a shoddy answer by all accounts, and Mr. Arcaria seemed to accept it, if unwillingly. That's a shame. His smile came back quickly, as if he had forgotten and had left him. Well, I hope to meet you again. Damian, have a wonderful evening. Good night. Tim waited until Mr. Arcaria shut the doors behind him before turning to Damian. Why'd you not say anything about this? Now your principal probably thinks I'm an asshole. He groaned, frowning at Damian. Someone has to go to these things with you, or at least make an excuse to not come. Throw up in class next time or something. It was brash and accusatory wording. He wasn't even sure why it mattered so much. At least he'd come. Who cared if no one had joined him? It was his ridiculous event anyway. Tch. Damian turned his back, marching off towards the bush and away from dealing with his brother. That really seemed to set Tim off, as he narrowed his eyes, reaching for Damian. What the hell? Don't walk away from me! Tim pulled at Damian's arm as he turned to walk, digging harshly into his bruises. Usually, physicality did not truly bother Damian, as it gave him an excuse to reciprocate the motion. And it truly was typical for their dynamic. But tonight, it just hurt. He had to stop himself from hissing. I had to hear about this from a memo while I was clearing out my inbox. What's wrong with you? Damian stared at the ground, as if it would perhaps oblige him and swallow him whole. He hadn't considered the optics of the situation, of why it would seem odd for Damian Wayne to be alone. Of course, saving face should be the top priority when leading a double life. It was unreasonable of Tim to be so angry in his opinion. However, he needed to de-escalate this somehow. He tightened his expression, preparing to spit out the word as if it pained him to do so, which it would in a second. Sorry. The small of his back thrummed in a burning hurt, but he didn't let his demeanor falter, his eyes still latched to the concrete of the ground. Tim sighed, letting go as his hands fell limply to his sides. No, look, it's not the end of the world, but you should have, mentioned it to somebody, because you can't be going to events like this alone. People are going to make some assumptions about Bruce and everything. Or me, Alfred, heck, even Cass. They occupied a silent space, the only noise the occasional car horn echoing through the streets. Is something wrong? Tim asked suddenly, his voice much softer than it had been before. Damian didn't reply, letting seconds drag out until his brother finally relented with a frown. Let's just go. Tim turned his back and stepped forward. And the night should have ended there, really. A silent car ride home to an equally quiet manor, a noiseless entrance to his room, and a soundless inhabitants he'd have to have in his bed. But things didn't work out so easily for Damian, and that was an unchanging reality. 2 vans pulled up beside their car, effectively boxing the vehicle in. Damian took an instinctual step backward. Men poured out, large guns in their hands and serious expressions on their faces. Put your hands up, one growled, and Tim stiffened by his side as the men pointed their weapons at them. This was decidedly not good. And that is the end of Chapter 7 of The Sound of Damian Wayne. Author's notes. Ooh, cliffhanger. Why would I do that? So evil. Tim, you need to push it, bud. You're so cryptic. My fault, but still. I may or may not have given myself sun poisoning, and now my feet are purple for some reason. Guys, don't forget to wear sunscreen. That's my message of the week. Or more specifically, don't fall asleep at the beach when the UV is 10. But the tan is looking good, not gonna lie, so that's a plus. And reader's notes from me. As I'm rereading this, I'm noticing all the little details you're planting there, Magnoliabee. I saw those little clues you were planting. Sure, I only recognized them when chapter 16 came out, and now that I'm rereading it, but like, I see what you're doing. I see what you're planting there. There's a whole, like, subplot with the witch, and you're planting little clues here and there. You're planting clues. I know what you're up to. The whole time when I was reading it, I was like, oh my god, Magnoliabee, they're like the Scott Coffin. I see what they're doing. It's subtle, but it's there. I know what you are. Okay, done obsessing over that. Well, thank you guys for reading, and wait, I just remembered something else. It's probably pretty common in most of my videos, but also specifically at the beginning of this one, and just now, I have issues, so you probably heard either my stomach growling or my throat gurgling, because I don't know how to burp, and those sounds are pretty common. I try my best to let those pass, and not make sound, but not always possible, so those definitely made sound. Yeah, I try and edit those out, but doesn't always work that way. Anyways, thank you guys for reading, and bye!